My name is Diana Marrero, as I said. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Development at Foreign Policy. And I want to give you a preview of what's to come. Since we launched Her Power 4 years ago, the program has really reached thousands of people around the world in dozens of countries. And despite the challenges of the pandemic, we've been able to continue to garner momentum for this program with the support of many partners and participants without whom none of this would be possible. We're thrilled by the level of interest and engagement we've been able to mobilize over the years to elevate critical gender issues, such as female political participation, the caregiving crisis, equal financial and economic opportunities for women, the role of women in promoting sustainability and achieving the SDGs, access to education, women's health, and so much more. Against the turbulent geopolitical landscape, progress toward true gender parity is at risk. The time is now for solutions-oriented conversations with female experts and leaders from around the world on how to prevent and reverse this backsliding before it's too late. Thank you again for lending your voice to these timely and critical conversations. This year's summit takes a deep dive into the continued barriers to women's political participation and equal access to investment and economic opportunities, underscoring something that many of you today already know, and that's that women and girls are really the key to ensuring an inclusive and sustainable and successful post-pandemic recovery. And in fact, study after study has shown that increasing gender equality globally would translate to trillions more in world GDP. Today we'll be hearing from a series of fantastic speakers, including experts working across media, government, the private sector, civil society, and leaders spearheading change from the grassroots to multinational levels. These include Rita Jo Lewis, the president and CEO of Exim Bank, actor Connie Nielsen, humanitarian, and Ambassador Isabel Coleman of USAID, Catherine Russell of UNICEF, Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Stanley from the State Department, Congresswoman Dina Titus and Maria Elvira Salazar, and many others, so you're in for a real treat. I want to take a moment to thank our partners who have helped make this summit possible today. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, AARP, Chemonics, PSI, and Global Citizen. Thank you all for the support you've lent us. And before we get started, I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping notes. We have a diverse audience from all over the world joining and tuning in via our live stream, and on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn Live as well, so we want to hear from you. For those of you who are logged into our events webpage, foreignpolicy.com/events, please remember to submit questions via the question button on your screen. We'll try to include as many audience questions as possible today during our live sessions. If you're joining us on social media, please do chime in on the conversation using the hashtag FPHerPower, and you can submit questions to events@foreignpolicy.com via email as well. So let's make sure this conversation is heard far and wide. And finally, we're thrilled to be able to bring back our in-person mentorship luncheon this year. Our mentors span the gamut of fields from financial services to technology to diplomacy and academia, and these women leaders will host their own individual breakout sessions over lunch, focusing on one of 6 Gender Equality Forum Action Coalitions. You'll hear more on that from my colleague Claire Furbush later this morning. And for those of you tuning in online, you'll have a roughly 1-hour break before we resume our main stage programming at around 1:10 Eastern Standard Time. So thank you for joining us. We hope today's summit is inspiring and will inspire conversations and movements around the world and spark the change we need for a more equitable world. And so now let's dive right in. Thank you.
Please welcome the House Foreign Affairs Committee member representing Nevada's 1st District, Congresswoman Dina Titus, in conversation with Eva Rodriguez, the editor-in-chief of the Fuller Project.
I think you're the next one. Terrific. Hi, everybody. And thank you, Congresswoman, for being here. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Well, thank you.
Before we get into the foreign policy aspect of this, I can't have you sitting here and not ask about the midterms. And Nevada Democrats did fairly well, no?
Well, we did. We kind of broke the mold, so that was it. But it was tough going for a while. But well, let me say first, thank you for including me in this. This is quite an honor and a pleasure to be with y'all today. Her power really sums it up as I do foreign policy and in campaigns. Women are really the agents of change, so it's nice to be here. And there's nothing that makes you feel better than to be in a room full of beautiful, smart, powerful women. So thank you very much for having me. I am glad that I'll be returning to Congress next session because it was a tough race. In fact, all of Nevada was a toss-up. You know, we are really a purple state. But our senator won, so we held the Senate with Catherine Cortez Masto, the first Hispanic woman senator. All three members of the House, Democrats in Southern Nevada, won. Margins range from 1% to 5%, but you just need one more than the other guy, and we managed to do that. My district is Las Vegas. I hope some of you have been to visit me in Las Vegas. It's a good place to come and have a little fun after being locked up for 2 years and get some frustrations out. But it's an interesting place to represent.
Yeah. So again, before we pivot to the foreign policy,
sure.
What differences do you see for the coming Congress? What is now completely off the table because you no longer have the majority in the House? And where are possibilities for compromise?
Well, compromise is kind of a hanging crime these days, so we'll be really looking for that. But you know, the big difference is yesterday and today we're having our leadership elections. So Nancy Pelosi will not be leader, and that will be a drastic change. She has left such a legacy and has been such a powerful woman leader and just knows how to make it work and deliver those votes for important policies. But she and Steny Hoyer will be replaced by new or younger, very exciting new leaders, and so that will be a big difference. Being in the minority will certainly not be as much fun as the majority, so we'll be playing a lot of defense, I think. I worry about some of the things that we have done that we're so proud of that might get rolled back. You know, you've heard the talk of some members of the Senate going to put in an abortion ban, a national abortion ban. Some of the environmental protections might be rolled back. LGBT yesterday had a big victory in the Senate, but certainly didn't go as far as the House did. What the main problem, I think, is that we won't get anything done for the next 2 years because the Republicans, if I can be partisan for a minute, have no agenda. I mean, they got no plans. They want to get rid of Social Security and Medicare like they used to want to get rid of Obamacare, but they don't offer anything to replace it. And they have said this is just going to be one investigation after another. They're going after Homeland Security, going after Beau Biden, going after Dr. Fauci. So they're going to spend all their time doing that and not much time doing policy, and that is to the detriment of the country. And those campaigns were so negative, you know, it's kind of hard to go from one day having somebody tell you you're awful, you're a liar, they want to kill you, to the next day going, oh, well, I know you were just joking, let's work together on something.
Yeah. So I want to jump on, you mentioned the passage of legislation, well, of the bill in the Senate a couple of days ago. That would codify the right to same-sex marriage federally. I think it also would codify Loving v. Virginia. Right. No question, interracial marriage would be recognized. And I think it might have surprised many of us that there were 12 Republicans who joined in. Not all of whom are lame ducks, right?
True, that's true.
I want to pivot now to your long time interest and work on the GLOBE Act.
Oh, yes.
First, I would want you to please explain what that is and why is that important?
Well, I forget what the acronym stands for. It's a lot of letters, but Globe seems to sum it up. You know, the U.S. has been out front, even though we were slow in coming. Once we got there, it's been pretty all speed ahead on LGBTQ rights and protections. And I just believe that it shouldn't stop at the border. If we're going to be an international leader, our foreign policy should be reflective of what our values are. Our own State Department should reflect what our values are. And the countries that we support, donate to, build up their democracies, should support some of those same values. So this bill would take our LGBTQ policy that's internal and try to promote it externally. And the main way is to say, don't just do as we say, do as we do, and reflect that in the structure and in the policies of the State Department itself.
We tend to vacillate as a country from we don't want to be the world's policeman
Right.
to we need to be the world's leader, right?
That's right.
In terms of issues that impact women globally, within our borders and beyond, are there some that are top of mind for you for the United States to show that kind of leadership that you just described on the LGBTQ front?
Well, you see it in so many different countries in different ways. One that we have renewed not too long ago is the Violence Against Women Act. Certainly that should be something that we make a priority. We shouldn't be supporting regimes that tolerate violence against women. And we know in war settings, women are greater victims than men in many ways. They may or may not be on the battlefield, but regardless, they are left with the children or with the family or trying to make it after the war is over. And they're often victims of war crimes, which include rape and violence against women. So I think that would certainly be a priority.
Yeah. And you have also shown tremendous interest and leadership in terms of Ukraine and the impact that that conflict has had on women. To take from your last statement and bring it to this critical moment, what do you see and what do you think needs to be done?
Well, several things are happening. Because men stayed to fight, 90% of the people who have left Ukraine are women and children. So they have had all the trauma of leaving behind their possessions, their pets, their family, to go to some place of refuge that may not speak their own language. They don't have any kind of income. They're refugees dependent on other people to take care of them or try to start a new life. So that's a real challenge. About 20% of the military in Ukraine, women have equal status in the military, so some women or some of the military members are women, and that's a whole nother set of problems. Chain of command, equal status, sexual abuse too for women in the military, and that's not just Ukraine, that's been in this country as well. So that's another issue. And women are often kind of the sandwich generations. They live longer than men, so they're older and have greater needs, and the women in the middle have to take care of the children and the parents, and that's another problem in Ukraine with so many older people who have just been displaced either within the country or gone somewhere else, who are just kind of at a loss.
Yep. Can't let this moment with you pass without also speaking about Iran and what's happening there after the protest erupted, after the death of a young woman who was arrested. We can even use that legal term of art for not wearing hijab and not complying with the dress code. What is your view on what the United States should do in that situation?
Well, that was, I think they called them the moral police. Is that it? We have to always be careful about the moral police because sometimes it's their morals, not our morals, that they're trying to uphold. This is a good example of women being agents of change. That whole disruption, those the protests in the streets, the anti-government movement has really been fueled by women. And because the woman was the victim, the symbolism is related to women, and women have taken to the streets. I think the U.S. has to be careful about intervening in what's going on in other countries when it comes to domestic issues, but you certainly want to be vocally supportive. You want to help any maybe NGOs that are helping on the ground there. Refugees that come out of that, we want to be supportive. You know, it's not just Iran, though. Look at the women in Afghanistan connected to education of girls. I mean, that, again, was women leading that movement. So wherever you go, and I'm on House Democracy Partnership, and we go and try to shore up new democracies, we always want to meet with groups that do her power, because that's really where the change comes. And an area where you find women really engaged is corruption in government. Women who are newly elected in young democracies, that's something that they go after because they haven't been part of the corrupt system and they have been abused by it.
Yeah. So we're running out of time,
I'm
unfortunately.
sorry.
No,
I'm talking too much.
we could probably speak for hours here. I would love it, but we only have a minute and a half.
Okay.
One thing I've been wondering about, is there ever a sort of day or moment on the Foreign Affairs Committee where you focus on issues affecting women globally? Is there such a thrust there to look at global issues through that gender lens and how certain issues impact women?
There's not a caucus within the House Foreign Affairs Committee. There's a women's caucus generally, and usually it comes in a piecemeal fashion. Different women will introduce bills. Lois Frankel from Florida has been on that committee, and she's always doing some kind of legislation for women. Certainly the Globe Act included those kinds of things. So it usually depends on the issue, but there will always be one of us to ask a question of the witnesses. How does this impact women? Or many times the witnesses are women and can speak from their own experiences as well as maybe from a scholarly or a foreign policy approach.
We have about a minute and a half left. What haven't I asked you about that you're dying to talk about?
Well,
Is there anything?
well, I always enjoyed talking to women. I taught political science for 35 years at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and I taught women in politics. But my main goal was always to recruit young women to the process. And that's something that has happened because of the abortion issue. More young women registered to vote, participated, and really drove that message, because suddenly they realized something they've taken for granted that maybe their mothers or grandmothers fought for, they do risk losing. And so it really was an issue that energized young women. And so once you're in the process, you're not as likely to drop out, and I find that very refreshing.
Gotcha. Well, Congresswoman, thank you so very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
It was a pleasure, and hope we can speak again.
Let's do it.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Up next, joining Eva to give her view from Capitol Hill, please welcome House Foreign Affairs Committee member Congresswoman Maria Salazar from Florida.
Por favor, aquí.
Thanks, of course, thanks. And good morning to all of you.
Welcome, welcome. I almost launched into a Spanish conversation because it turns out that the Congresswoman and we grew up within a few miles of each other.
Okay, where's that?
Westchester.
Of course, that's my district.
And there you go.
Redistricting, all of Westchester is mine.
Awesome.
That's the land of the free.
Awesome. So I'm sure we have a tremendous amount in common. I cannot, and one of the things I love about Foreign Policy Magazine and the website is it really is fair and honest. And so I wouldn't be fair if I didn't ask you, as I asked your colleague just before you. So what do you make of the midterms? What changes do you see as a result of now your party is in charge?
Yeah, it's, well, I think this is a great question. First of all, thank you for hosting me and for giving me the opportunity to talk to all these wonderful women. Midterm was not what the party was expecting. You see, I'm still a journalist.
There you go.
You see, I was one of the founders of Spanish television, 35 years working for Univision and Telemundo. So I still have my journalist cap on. I would say that maybe people that are the voters outside of Florida did not see what we in Florida are seeing, which is that there are some threats to the system, that it has nothing to do with political parties, whether you're Democrat or Independent or Republican. We all want to further and preserve the American exceptionality. And maybe we're concerned about some of the movements happening not only within some parts of the Democratic Party, but in media and academia that don't resemble what we want to see this nation going towards. And I think that's what happened, that people did not see those threats. Also, that the abortion issue was very important for some of the voters in other parts of the country, not necessarily Florida. So, but still, what I always say to everyone is, regardless of what happened, we still have the best, most transparent, not perfect, but electoral system in the world. And Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua and those areas that I represent, many of the people who are fleeing those countries still appreciate and love the American exceptionality and the American electoral system that still gives you the opportunity to voice what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and what's important for you. If abortion is important for you, you have the right to vote. If socialism is important for you, you have the right to vote. That is what I rescue from this wonderful election. And that's what I would like to preserve as a member of Congress.
Gotcha, thank you. So for those who may not be as familiar with your background generally as I am, simply because it's similar, talk to us about how your experience coming from being born into a Cuban exile family, right?
Changes your whole perspective, right?
But how?
I'm sure that you understand. Well, because you are a product of your experiences. And I would say that, well, I was born in Miami, first generation Cuban American. My parents fled when they were 25. My parents, my grandparents, everyone that I know around me, just like in Westchester, you guys have Cuban Americans took over your area, and they all came with one common experience or cause: freedom. The Cuban Revolution has been the most cruel, the most perversive, the most evil revolution that the hemisphere has seen. I mean, the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, ever since the arrival of Christopher Columbus. And I'm not exaggerating. Fidel mastered not only how to gain power, but how to maintain it at any cost. And that's why they're still there. So when my community hears the word socialism, they run the other way, period. There are no ands, ifs, or buts. So I'm a product of that experience. My voters are a product of that experience. And when we hear other people saying, no, this is not the same thing. Bernie Sanders, perfect example. He says, we're not talking about Cuba or Venezuela, we're talking about Norway. Yeah, but Norway is not a socialist country. It has socialist policies or programs. So we get very nervous and very afraid when we hear that word. So that's my product. I'm a product of that. My voters are a product of that. That's why I was able to flip a seat that was in the hands of one of the most important members of the Democratic Party. Her name is Donna Shalala. She was the longest serving member of the Clinton administration. She was the president of the Clinton Foundation. She was the president of the University of Miami. So she was a very well-known figure, and she was the incumbent. And this girl, this Cuban girl from Miami, whom they used to call a prompter reader, because I was on television, was able to unseat her because of that threat. Well, you know,
There you
like
go.
because of that
You've
threat.
got fans.
Um,
Let me ask you this, though, because it is something that has always fascinated and bugged me, to use a legal term.
Sure.
And that is that Hispanics, Latinos, however you identify,
Right.
we tend to be lumped together, right?
Yeah.
The Latino vote, the Hispanic
Right,
vote. Well,
right.
if you look at the Latino vote in South Florida, it's heavily Republican. If you look at Latino votes in other parts of the country, even in Orlando, right?
The Puerto Ricans.
Puerto Rican, and Texas is different. How do we make sense of the Latino vote?
Well, I think that the Latino vote or the Hispanic vote has come together, and this last election was a good example of it. The Puerto Ricans voted Republicans. We're talking about people that are registered Democrat. And hey, that's great. You vote whatever you want to, and you vote for whomever you think represents you best. I think this time around, Hispanics understood that going back to those policies that are being peddled by the Democratic Party. I'm not saying that everyone, because I serve in Congress with very honorable people who are serving as Democrats, but defunding the police, the gender ideology, not being able to really control what your kids are learning in school, the socialist word, right? Getting money and not really being able to go to work, inflation, high gas prices, all of that affected this big minority, which is the #1 minority in the country for those that still don't realize it. Hispanics, Browns, Latinos, we are the largest minority. We're more than the African Americans. And we have some of the values that are entrenched in the American exceptionality. Let's don't call it the Republican. In the American experience, God-fearing, law-abiding, tax-paying, small government, having the right to go to work, wake up in the morning, take the opportunity, being able to fail. You went into bankruptcy, but you started again after 7 years, and they give you another credit. You know, all that is what we are here for. Your parents came looking for that. If not, your parents would have gone to, I don't know, Switzerland. But they came to the United States.
It was too cold.
It was too cold.
I'm sorry.
So,
No, I draw the line.
We got the best.
Yeah.
This country is still the best on earth.
Yeah. So, you mentioned earlier, and you mentioned all of these challenges and ideals, right? We, and I too was brought up saying this is, the best country on the planet.
Still is.
Right? But deeply flawed. So we have to work.
Of course.
To make it.
Not perfect.
Right.
But the best.
Right.
Which
So.
is two different things.
Te oigo. I hear you.
Good.
Absolutely. So what are particular challenges? You mentioned Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, as from your perspective, problem
Because
areas.
because they're not free.
Yeah. I hear you.
You have an authoritarian regime. Who wants to live under that?
No
one.
People are very much suffering there for a number of
Ask me, I know it
reasons.
well. You want me to give you details?
Give me a detail.
Well, at Cuba, that's hell. Is the hottest part of hell. It's Cuba. As a journalist, I interviewed people who,
Including Mr. Castro, no?
oh, I interviewed him, yeah, and he's Satan himself, and that's another story which I can tell you at any other time. But having him in front of you for 3 hours, you do feel the power, the aura of what Satan looks like, no doubt. But he created a country where people would build a little raft, and they would have to calculate whether to stay or to leave. And once they decided to go to the ocean, they were going to face the sharks. So I interviewed people who one of their legs was eaten up by a shark, and the brother was eaten up by the shark, and one of them finished their trip and got to Miami, but the other one died eaten in the middle of the ocean. And the brother saw how the other brother was eaten by the sharks. He lived, the other one died. Do you think people have to go through that experience? But it was better to go through that than to stay in Cuba.
Yeah. But the thing is, at least in theory, right, the revolution in Cuba was meant to counteract,
of course,
a deeply entrenched
help women, help
corruption.
the poor, the African-Americans.
Right. Don't women there have more opportunity, actually, maybe not to, make a lot of money, but become a doctor?
No. Well, yeah, that has a price. You look, this is the social contract that Fidel did with the women. You're going to give me your life, right? You're going to give your life. You're going to give me your freedom, and I'm going to let you go to the university. But then after you graduate as a doctor, and I interviewed many of the people that I'm going to tell you now, you can be a gynecologist, but I'm only going to pay you $200, which is in reality $20 a month. And then you're going to be forced to prostitute yourself and be a jinetera, which is the term, jinetera, but you're a doctor, you are a gynecologist. And since you cannot feed your family, you have to work during the day at a local hospital because you love being a doctor. But then at night, you have to go and prostitute yourself to an Italian because that Italian is going to give you dollars. And you need those dollars to go to the shop and buy to the shop that is owned by the state, not Publix. And then you're going to buy milk for your child. So that's your scenario as a woman. And if not, you catch the raft. You know how many people I interviewed, how many women I interviewed under those terms? That they had, you know what it is to have to prostitute yourself after you went to medical school just because the local government doesn't allow you to earn a decent living? Despicable.
We're going to have to let that be the last word. And you have perfect timing.
Jesus Christ.
I mean, but thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to
Long
speak
live
with
the
you.
United States.
We could have, again, as with Congresswoman Titus, could have spoken for hours.
Of course.
Thank you all.
Of course.
Thank you.
Of course, thanks.
Muchas gracias.
De nada, encantada. Gracias por la oportunidad.
Yeah, sí.
All right.
We hug and kiss when we
Of course.
go to the bathroom.
We're Latins.
So, yeah, we are.
Next, please welcome Ratna Sahe, the Senior Advisor on Gender at the IMF, Hannah Brixey, Global Director for Gender at the World Bank, and Peggy Clark, President and CEO of the International Center for Research on Women. This discussion, focused on prioritizing women in post-pandemic recovery, will be led by Rena Ninan, veteran journalist and founder of Good Trouble Productions.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So grateful you could join us, and I am so excited about this amazing panel of women who are just rock stars in the fields in what they're doing. But before we kick off, I want to share with you something we're really proud of at Foreign Policy. We do a podcast called Hero, The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women, looking at entrepreneurship and raising up women in developing countries. What really works when you're trying to help women become entrepreneurs, help them in the private sector and within their countries. So I'd like to turn your attention to the screens to take a look at our trailer.
I actually didn't get any support from a bank or from the government. There were no loans available. It was a real hustle.
What do you do when the banks are against you, the laws are against you, and you feel that society is pinning you down because you're a woman? How about change the system? For Foreign Policy, I'm Rena Ninan with Hero, the Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women podcast. We're focusing on some of the biggest financial hurdles women face around the world, like property rights.
There are men here and they want to demolish the store. and they have bulldozers.
And we show you how investing in these women can help grow the global economy.
Microfinance is very simple. It's not rocket science. We tell women take money to earn money, and that's it.
We talked to Nobel Prize economist and expert on global poverty, Esther Duflo.
Giving money has the same effect as giving food, but giving money is much cheaper.
And Melinda Gates.
When we do things, we empower them with loans, we empower them with knowledge, we pull men into the conversation to support them, we can actually change societies and change the world.
And this December, we're coming out with a whole new season.
We had police officers talking about 1 or 2, 3 cases. And when the medical professionals presented their statistics, it was about 2,000 cases that they have seen of women and girls presenting themselves with pregnancy complications as a result of going through FGM. So you can see this discrepancy.
Subscribe to The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women, a podcast from Foreign Policy funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts.
I hope you guys will subscribe. Season 3 drops on December 13th. And I have to say, the Foreign Policy podcast team does a lot of really great podcasts. It's worth checking out. We're going to talk on this panel about prioritizing women in the post-pandemic recovery. And Ratna Sahai, I'd love to start with you, with your perspective from the IMF. What I love about you, Ratna, is you have been in economics, finance, you really understand it, and you've always had this passion for gender, which is what you're focused on at IMF. But as we know, coming out of this pandemic, countries are so worried about so many different issues. Why should gender really matter?
So first of all, let me just say that it's a real pleasure to be here at the Her Power Summit and to serve on this panel. That question, Reena, is really $1 million question. Both figuratively and otherwise. The answer to that question is really very simple. And the answer is that the world right now is facing many, many problems. Inflation, threat of recession, the food and energy price shock. We are still not out of the pandemic. And of course, it's understandable that policymakers are focused on these topics. But you know what? We really have to change the framing and the paradigm because women are a huge part of the solution. Why? Yeah. Because there are many studies that we have done at the IMF. There are writers outside the IMF, and they show something which is absolutely critical and important for everybody. And that is, if you reduce gender disparities, you close these gaps, it leads to higher economic growth, it leads to lowering inequality, and it leads to enhancing both economic and financial resilience.
So you're saying for countries, there's a real, substantive, tangible economic benefit. Are there any countries that you can point to that we might be surprised in the transformation they're making? Because so many people were pushed back in this pandemic.
Yeah. You know, so because the gender disparities are so large, and when you talk to, say, policymakers, they say, well, all this is going to take time. Mm-hmm. And that is simply not true. You know why? We have a fantastic example, actually, of Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, okay. Very interesting. So they decided to empower women and get them into the workforce. And in just about 5 years, the female labor force participation, which was something like 25%, is now more than 35%. This was their goal for 2030. They've already met the goal.
How were they able to do that in such a short time then?
Well, first of all, a lot of women there are very highly educated. Yeah. All they needed was to be empowered to go and work.
Mm-hmm. Hannah, I want to turn to you and sort of look at this concept that Ratna was saying about increasing female labor participation. What have you seen from a World Bank perspective when you look at the research where programs or things that you've done that's really made a difference in getting more women in?
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here because, as Ratna said, women and women empowerment is part of the solution. And I would say part of the evidence we see that when there is women's leadership and women's participation in decision making, the decisions are much better and enterprises are more profitable and communities are also better run. So delighted to be here. Now, let me perhaps first briefly reflect on what Ratna said. Ratna made a number of important points, including that there is research that shows how much economies and societies could gain by closing the employment gaps that women are facing. Now, the research that the World Bank Group has done, it's showing that on average, it's 20% of GDP in countries.
That's significant.
That's significant. And the surprising fact is that even here in the United States, it's almost 10% of GDP that could be gained if the employment gaps are closed. Now, of course, employment gaps, it means partly female labor force participation, but it's also the kind of jobs that women have access to. It's the access to sectors where there is higher productivity. It is access to economic activities that are better paid. Mm-hmm. From research, we see that, for example, take sub-Saharan Africa. Female labor force participation is relatively high. But female farmers, half of the farmers in sub-Saharan Africa are women. Female farmers, on average, have their productivity, the output per land, 30% lower. Now, why is it? Why is it? It's access to credit. It's access to information, extension services, inputs such as seeds and fertilizers. And the access is limited due to gender gaps. Now, what works? So specifically, we have also done research showing that, for example, employing women in the agriculture extension services makes a huge difference. Mm-hmm. We have done research showing that engaging boys and girls in school in discussions about girls' empowerment, women's empowerment, the role of women in communities, in households, it also can make a difference.
So you're saying, you know, from a policy standpoint as well, like getting the boys on board at an early age can also be transformative.
If I would summarize briefly, so it's number one, it's the legal and policy reforms. Mm-hmm. 176 countries still have laws that discriminate against women when it comes to economic activities. So it's law and policies. Second, it is programs that encourage and empower women. Care, access to care, access to skills, even though we see that actually that has improved significantly over the years, and programs such as Cash Plus, cash with information, cash with technical assistance, with assets to support entrepreneurship. So it's programs. And then the big bucket, social norms. And that's where engaging boys and men is so important, and thinking, who are the influencers? I can give you examples from, for example, the Sahel countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where under World Bank project, it has been very effective to engage local religious leaders. Wow. Who then influence the boys and men. And it makes a difference. We have done impact evaluations showing that the boys start to think differently about child marriage and the role of women in life.
Because you look at these societies where the religious makers are hugely influential in everyday life. What a great point. Peggy, I want to turn to you, as the president of the International Center for Research on Women. You guys put out some great data. And we know, and it's a big thing of our podcast on Hero, is how having tangible data can be transformative. Right. When you get that data, how do you convince the policymakers in these countries that here's what you need to do and here's how it can make a vast difference?
Right, that's such a great question. And also thank you so much, Rena, and thank you to the summit. It's so lovely for us to be back together here, and I'm honored to be with my colleagues, and we're all singing the same song. But I think the point that I want to raise about data is we are in this incredible moment of crisis post-COVID, but it's also a huge opportunity. What has come into the light, it's like we've cracked open the egg or done the great reveal on Project Runway, which is what we've always known for decades, that women's care and unpaid work is a fundamental part of the healthy functioning of societies. But what happened during COVID was it shut whole nations down. When women couldn't get their children to school, when markets were closed down, we saw the relationship between the health of families and the importance of unpaid care work, both of children and of elderly people, to the functioning of a society. And so to your question, in answer to your question about data and the importance of it, we have a moment to talk about, and this is what we need to do right now, move into, as my colleagues are doing at IMF and World Bank, what does that mean? What would that mean if we recognize the care economy? So in some of our work, for example, in India, we've developed a care policy scorecard. And some of this is very obvious. It's around childcare provisions, it's around maternity leave provisions, it's around issues related to social protections. In Kenya, we're working with the Kenya government around the informal sector workers and what kinds of social protections are there for them. So we must immediately step into this moment of advocating for what would it look like if we really recognize the care economy. It's affected every single one of us in every country of the world. So the crisis that has led to a regression in women's labor participation, we have gone back in time, is an opportunity for us because economies cannot function without women at the center. And so I think data is really, really critical. And I want to just say one more small point. We often wonder, you look at, for example, we had the Generation Equality Forum 25 years after Beijing. Where have we made progress? Girls' education, some progress, political leadership. Not very much progress in women's. What is that? Here we all are, hundreds of us, thousands of us on the line. And one of the reasons is gender norms. And so some of the work we're doing also is working in the schools. What are men's and boys' expectations? Gender norms is a pervasive, fundamental element in overcoming and moving towards a more gender equal world. And so this is real data, this is real research that we're doing that allows us to see how you can change these norms so that men in families are more comfortable doing caregiving tasks, are more comfortable doing housework. And so there are solutions, and now's our moment to bring them forward.
I want to invite everyone, if you've got a question and you're joining us online from home or the office, feel free to send us your questions to any of our panels. And if there's, I believe we have some mics here. Okay, Allison back there has got a mic. If you want to raise your hand if you've got a question for our panelists, and Allison will head to you. And we've got another mic back there as well, Owen, I believe. And right here as well. So if anybody has a question, feel free to raise your hand. Hannah, I want to sort of pick up with you on this about what are the laws on the care piece that we can help figure out that can be transformative? Are there any laws that you're seeing around the world that have been transformative or could offer guidance to other countries in making a difference?
With respect to care, it's a question of laws and regulatory frameworks. Yeah. Often there is a full range of restrictions for the provision of care. And the provision of care kind of falls in between ministerial responsibilities. It's to some extent it's Ministry of Health, some extent Ministry of Education, in some countries Ministry of Social Affairs. So I think the key constraint when it comes to policies, laws, and regulatory framework is not so much the laws themselves, but the need for a collective action and really coordinated effort, so that there is a better understanding on what the constraints are, and also opening in the fiscal space for investments so that the care is affordable and quality. Now, I mentioned that there is too much regulation. Of course, it's very important to have good regulation for quality and good oversight of quality, because care, childcare in particular, is important not only for women's empowerment, but it's critical also for early childhood development and for building human capital. So in fact, the care has impact that is positive across generations, but there needs to be strong emphasis on quality as well as affordability. And that requires a coordinated action across ministries. It also requires a good consideration what space there should be for private provision, with some subsidies that would target poorer households, and as I said, with strong quality oversight.
Ratna, I want to talk to you because you really understand also the financial sector, the private sector and all of this. And as Hannah was talking about, laying out why this is so important, how do you convince these private companies beyond the government and a place like the IMF, how do you convince them? What have you found in a room makes a difference to get them to open up their pocketbooks and take this as a serious issue?
Thank you, Rina. I mean, let me just begin by saying that at the IMF, what has been really transformational is it's the first time that we have come out with a gender mainstreaming strategy. And what is the big deal about that is that our vision is to embed a gender lens in all our activities. So that encompasses, our macro policies, our financial policies, the recommendations we give to countries. It also includes the loans that we might give. And also we are there to provide capacity development to these countries who want to adopt these policies.
Do they push back? Or, these countries want these loans from you, from the IMF. How are those conversations? Do you find that they're interested and they get it, or?
So we are just beginning, but I have to tell you that I was so encouraged. We had our annual meetings, the World Bank IMF annual meetings, and there were a number of finance ministers and governors of central banks who wanted to meet me, since I was the senior advisor on gender, and wanted to ask what they could do in their respective countries. And this covered...
Can you name some names? Are there countries that you were surprised with that are I'm very curious to know?
I don't think I should mention names, just because I might leave out some others.
Okay.
But they covered, what I can tell you is they covered a wide range from advanced economies, emerging markets, as well as low-income countries. So the key point that I make to them on the question that you asked, again, this is very much based on the research I myself have done. That's the maximum work I've done in the last 7 years, which relates to, women, finance, and fintech now. And there are 4 or 5 points I want to make. First, what we have found is that if you increase more underprivileged people, both men and women, into the financial sector in terms of access to financial services, economic growth is higher. However, we also find that if you include more women at the margin, income inequality actually falls much more. Another evidence that we have seen is, and this goes back to what Hannah was mentioning about the importance of women in leadership positions, is that we find if there are more women as board members, the share of women as board members in the banking sector and also in the fintech sector, the financial performance of the banks, the fintech companies is much higher in terms of lower non-performing loans, in terms of higher revenue. But you know what? The facts are, and this should be shocking for all of us, is that if you look around the world and you look at how many women CEOs there are on banks, it's about 5%. Yeah. These are big banks, cross-country studies. What is the proportion of women on the boards? Not just of banks, but fintech companies, but also regulatory bodies. Another point that Hannah made is really important. And they are about 20%.
Wow.
Yeah. Interesting fact, they are among the highest in sub-Saharan Africa. Actually.
Is that right?
Yeah, higher than the advanced economies.
Wow.
Why?
Yeah, why is that?
Well, that is a million-dollar question, because we always talk about the social, religious, cultural norms being much worse in emerging markets as well as in low-income countries. But what we have also found, there are studies that show that actually signal from the top matters, policies matter much more than these social and cultural norms. So we should really take encouragement from that fact. And this is a message to our top leaders. You want to take action? It works.
It works.
It worked in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I was very surprised to hear you say that.
Right?
Peggy, I want to talk a little bit more about what we've learned under COVID, particularly for the unpaid care force, moms that are at home not getting paid for caring for their children. If the lessons we learned on this were actually implemented, what kind of change could we see?
Well, we would see increase in women's labor force participation. Absolutely, if we recognized the fundamental nature of the importance of women's realities and the constraints that they face. I think every single one of us experienced this need to retract from the labor force in every country of the world. So what would it look like? Well, there would be, we see it in some of the countries that are leading in the gender equality indexes. For example, these are very basic. Childcare policies, maternity leave policies, flexibility policies, but also to your point, the particular explicit outreach to get women's involvement in economies, in industries within the economy that they have been excluded from for many years, manufacturing and others, and to encourage at a really much younger age that everything is possible for women. But for example, let me just give you an example of if women were fully participating and some of the lessons from COVID. Of course, everyone is thinking about the climate crisis. Many of you just returned from the climate talks. Did you know that less than 2% of climate finance dollars go to women-led climate action? And this is because there's no data to show that there's a very strong return on investment for investing in women-led solar companies and women-led water management companies. So there is still this lag between what we say about gender equality and the actual mechanisms. And this is where we're so excited. IMF has a new gender equality strategy and your leadership at the World Bank. Much of this is behind moving resources into things that we know will unlock women's superpowers. So
Can I follow on Peggy's points? Because this is very important to highlight. It is not enough to try to get to pre-COVID times, right? It is really important, especially now in the context of the crisis, to build on the research that shows that women are key for recovery, for economic recovery after the pandemic. They are key to solving the crisis such as food security, and I gave some numbers already. And they are key also to an effective climate action. And we have the evidence that when women participate in the decision making, in this designing and implementing climate actions, the climate actions are much more effective. We have the evidence, for example, from disaster risk management. So I think now it's the time really to use the pandemic as a springboard to show what women can do as leaders for the way forward.
In the couple minutes we have left on this panel, I'd love to sort of start with you and end with Ratna, but I've got two questions that I'd like sort of a lightning round for you to answer. What gives you the most hope as we're trying to transform this space? And is there a policy or a country or something that you have seen to watch, to flag to people that could be transformative in this space? Peggy?
I love that question. Rapid fire. Okay, India, Self-Employed Women's Association, 2 million. They're one of the oldest and largest trade associations of very low-income women. Elabat was a Gandhian leader who recently passed away, but she led the way for the economic power of women in the informal sector. There's 2,000 women in this salt industry, and those women have changed from diesel power to solar power and have increased effectiveness of that industry. There's no evaluation of that. We're partnering with them to bring those data forward. But then they bought land and they built a solar farm, and they're providing energy off the grid. So what gives me hope is as we all know in this room, the incredible resilience and power and entrepreneurship and innovation of women who've had to do this always in their families, in their communities, in their nations. So we need to together unlock that and think about Elabat and the salt pan workers and how they took the reins and led the way on a big challenge like climate.
Hannah?
What gives me hope that increasingly government leaders and decision makers are asking how. They are no longer asking why. And the investments in knowledge over the past years gives us some solutions, how. So that gives me hope that actually jointly with the kind of, as in partnerships and also facilitating collective actions in countries, that there is a clearer way forward and clearer commitment for the way forward. And in the World Bank Group, we are currently updating the World Bank Group gender strategy and very much kind of thinking through how to build on the evidence and how to help countries also to think about the theory of change toward gender equality. Now, countries to watch, there are many, and I'm really hopeful to see progress in many countries on the way forward. I would maybe highlight Bangladesh. I have been always intrigued by the decades of commitment to women's empowerment and by the approach also in Bangladesh, kind of engaging the community leaders and engaging women in communities to empower each other and also to empower and create opportunities for economic empowerment. So on the way forward now we see Bangladesh also making policy reforms, including childcare, including better opportunities for jobs to move women into the kind
Bangladesh.
of higher level value chain. So I would say
Right.
Bangladesh.
I love how you said it. They're not asking why, they're asking how, which is a significant change. Ratna.
So what gives me really hope is that, as you might know, that the IMF is 190 member countries. And I have to say, I was a bit nervous when I took the paper to the board for discussion.
Yeah.
And we came out incredibly, pleasantly, not just surprised, but also extremely happy. We got a really strong endorsement from all our member countries. So this is the top leadership.
A big one.
Hannah was actually there. I invited Hannah for that board meeting.
And it's the same in the World Bank group.
It's the same, so that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So that's what gives me hope. The other thing that also gives me hope is related to your second question, which is, you know, there are low-hanging fruits. Why are there low-hanging fruits? Why? Because the gender diversity is so wide.
Yeah, there's a lot
Once you
there.
start closing it,
Yeah.
it really works out.
Right.
I mean, I just want to give you a very quick example, again, from my home country.
We've got 60 seconds left,
Okay.
unfortunately. Yeah.
India, the Prime Minister said, why are the girls not going to the villages, in the villages to school? And he said, it's not because the parents don't want it, the girls don't want it. There are no bathrooms for girls. So he said, construct bathrooms all over the villages where there are no bathrooms. Big turnaround.
They started showing up. Yeah. Ratna, I want to thank you, Hannah, and Peggy, all of you for the work you're doing and for your perspective on coming out of this post-pandemic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, Rena will be joined by Ambassador Isobel Coleman, Deputy Administrator of USAID. Welcome, Ambassador Coleman.
Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Excited to sort of talk about this. When you're looking and applying sort of a gender lens to development, I know President Biden's new budget now calls for more than double, actually, money for gender programs in the previous year. Why is that? What do you think the White House is hoping to achieve?
I just heard you say on the last panel we shouldn't be asking the why anymore.
Yeah.
I think I think everybody in this room knows the why. The why is been documented and researched and written about for decades. When you invest in women and girls, it has such a positive impact, not only on the girl child, but on her family, on her community, on her country, on the global economy. We've seen it, across the board. Investing in women produces better health outcomes, it reduces fertility, it improves farmer yields, it is a bulwark against climate change.
I thought that was big, how Hannah said that. Hannah from the World Bank said that they're not asking the why, they're asking the how, which is pretty, I thought that's a moment. This is a moment.
I mean, I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs almost 20 years ago called The Payoff from Women's Rights. And I don't want to spend time anymore talking about why.
Yes. So,
but let's focus on the how.
On the how. So what is the White House hoping to achieve and how will they do it?
So in the fiscal year 23 budget request, as you noted, we have requested a doubling of our funding for programs to invest in women and girls. I mean, what we're hoping to achieve is much greater impact, more than a doubling of impact.
What does that mean when they say greater impact? Where would you believe that you and the White House would look at this and say, we took this money and it really paid off?
Well, it really cuts across everything we do today. I mean, you can't just say, oh, this is our gender pot. We find our gender money is in our agricultural spending, it's in our climate work, it's certainly in our educational work. We've just invested $50 million in the World Bank's CARE initiative. I heard the previous panel talking about the importance of investing in the care economy for women. The World Bank has estimated that some 600 million women are not in the workforce today because of lack of access to care, whether it's for child care, elder care, whatever it may be. 75% of unpaid care in the world is done by women. So that's just one example, but certainly when we're looking at food security around the world, we know that the majority today of subsistence farmers are women, and women have lower productivity than men. If you can invest in women's productive capacities, and it could be literacy training, you know, at the earliest levels to improve their productivity, you're going to have increases in food security around the world. So it really is across the board on everything that we're doing.
Can you point to what USAID has done in the space of women and girls where there's been some sort of transformative change?
Oh, I mean, there's so many examples. Right now, USAID is supporting 12 million girls in primary school around the world. And that is just this year.
Yeah.
You know, for decades we have invested in girls' education. And you've seen the gains. You know, one of the previous speakers noted Bangladesh as a success. I mean, Bangladesh has seen enormous strides. The US has invested heavily in women and girls empowerment and education, and in Bangladesh and in countries around the world. So Egypt, you know, girls' education, you've seen enormous strides in closing the gender gaps. Not that they have been fully closed, but you've seen a lot of progress, and USAID has really been behind a lot of those US government investments that have been made.
You just returned from a trip to Niger, which there is explosive population growth. But it's fascinating, there's also been some investment in girls' education. Tell me a little bit about what you saw.
Well, let me step back, and even before I went to Niger, I had an amazing conversation with the foreign minister who was here, who was talking about his challenges that he faces. He said, I face 3 challenges, 3 crises. I face a climate crisis. The country is in the Sahel, and it's seen rapid desertification. It faces conflict in the north of the country and in the south, across the country, and it's really conflict driven by a growing scarcity of resources. And then he took me by surprise, and he said, and my 3rd crisis is child marriage. And I thought, wow, that's interesting to have a foreign minister talking about child marriage. And he said, look, I have a population of 26 million people. It is one of the fastest, I think it is the fastest growth rate, fertility rate in the world today. A Nigerian woman is likely to have 7 children right now, which is fully 1 more child than the next highest, which means that the population will double every 18 years. And when you're looking at conflict and climate change, a doubling of your population puts enormous stresses. It's a source of opportunity, of course, but it's also puts an enormous stress on your systems or lack of systems. They don't have the ability to have all of their kids in school, and with such a fast-growing population, they have to invest. So it is a challenge. And girls, the girl child is so crucial to the gains that they want to make across the board. And they recognize that in Niger, 76% of girls are married before the age of 18, and a very large proportion are married before the age of 15, 14, 13. You have very young ages of marriage. Girls leave school for a whole variety of reasons. You heard some of them in the earlier panel. There's no sanitation facilities for women. For girls, schools are a long distance. You know, they're cultural factors. And when they leave school, they get married. And so one of the programs that we're doing in Niger is really trying to address that issue, those structural factors that really drive early marriage in Niger.
One country can't do it alone in this space. Obviously, you've got to have partnerships. Where do you feel that USAID has partnered, that's been partners or countries that have made a difference in this space?
Well, USAID can't do it alone. You know, a country can't do it alone, USAID can't do it alone. It really has to be a concerted effort that involves leadership of a country. Niger, right now, its leadership is very dedicated to trying to improve the status of girls and women in the society. But it needs money. You've got, for a country like Niger, the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, is working there and really investing also in women and girls. You've got the World Bank there trying to invest in infrastructure and building schools. And of course, you've got USAID there and other donors there that are really trying to all pull in the same direction to help this country achieve its objectives.
You guys recently, USAID recently concluded a public review on gender equality and women's empowerment. When you sort of look at that review, how have the agency's priorities shifted under the Biden administration?
Well, I think you've seen over many, many years, USAID, as I said, been investing in women and girls. I would say that the shifts today are really recognizing the intersection of women and girls' rights, the climate challenges, and making sure that women are very much on the front lines of being agents of change on climate. Also, increasingly recognizing the important role of women and girls in food security. So it's not revolutionary change, but more evolutionary change in that these things have been evident for a long time, but really doubling down on our investments. As I said, doubling our investments that we're making this year in women and girls, because we recognize that all of the challenges that we face, women and girls are at the center of it, both
so true.
Both as in many cases as victims, but more importantly as agents of change who can really deliver on results and really drive towards the outcomes that we're looking for.
I find sometimes it's also the same when you're talking about diversity. When you're talking about gender issues, there's still this sense among policy leaders, largely men, that feel this is sort of the feel-good thing. I've got to do this to check off the box for the US or for the IMF or for the World Bank. Do you find that sentiment? I know we talked about it's not so much the why anymore. How has tangible differences been, happened to these countries that might be on the fence about this?
I have been working in this space for a very long time, and I've been writing about these issues for a very long time. And I can tell you that 20 years ago, when I would sit down with finance ministers or labor ministers, and I would talk about the low workforce participation rate of women in their economies, they'd say, oh, but we have to find jobs for men first. Yeah. Women, they should stay home and take care of their kids. They need jobs first. We can't even employ the men. How can we think about the women? And I would show them research where countries that had higher workforce participation rates of women had higher workforce participation rates for men too. It's not zero sum. Women create jobs for other women and for men. And you could see them thinking, okay, today you have the foreign minister in Niger talking about child marriage. That is one of his priorities. I think there's been so much research done looking at, for example, the work that McKinsey has done. If you can bring women up to the same level of equality, economic opportunity and education, all sorts of things, around the world, it's $28 trillion of additional global GDP. That's 26%, more than a quarter of the world's economy. And the World Bank has done similar exercises looking at closing the gap in education between boys and girls. If you could really bring girls up to the same level as boys, over their lifetime, they would produce somewhere between $15 and $30 trillion more over their lifetime. These aren't small numbers, these are huge numbers. And I think that people in leadership positions in countries now much better understand this is not just checking a box to make the United States feel good. This is critical to their economic development. It is critical to their outcomes that they're looking for. We know it's a human rights issue. It's also an economic issue.
Final question. I know we've got to wrap up shortly here, but when you look at everything you've outlined for USAID, the policies, the review that you've just conducted, where do you believe you can see the most change in the coming years of this administration?
In the next couple of years?
In the next couple of years, yeah.
Well, I think that the harsh reality is that COVID was a huge setback for women and girls. You saw girls leave school, and there's a whole generation of girls, they're never going back. You saw women leave the workforce, and they're really going to lose, frankly, years, if not decades, off their productive, ability to participate in the economy. And I think that the focus and push that we have is to try to reverse those setbacks and really turbocharge the opportunities for women and girls. So it's doubling down again on education, on the care economy as an enabler for helping girls and women participate more fully and realize their full capacities. So I think we've experienced some setbacks. We need to really double down on the good work that we've been doing. Of course, food security is one of our highest priorities right now because of Russia's terrible invasion of Ukraine and destruction of the world's breadbasket in many ways, and making sure that the investments we're making in food security and really down at the subsistence farming level are very much focused on women too. We're likely to see the biggest gain. So, and climate. I mean,
Yes.
they're I haven't even talked much about that, but making sure that even just I mentioned increasing women's agricultural productivity allows less tilling of land and less use of fertilizer. I mean, the positive spillover effects are huge, but across the board, education, economic opportunities, climate change, and then also the legal environment. We continue to work with brave civil society actors around the world to really push on closing the legal gaps that exist for women.
Yeah, food security, climate, legal issues. You're so right to raise that. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you so much, Isabel Coleman with USAID, for your work decades in this space and holding people accountable on this. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
At this time, please turn your attention to the screens for an interview recorded earlier this week featuring FP columnist Lynn O'Donnell in conversation with FP staff writer Amy McKinnon.
Lynn, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm hoping to start by setting the scene. You've spent well over a decade covering Afghanistan, much of the US war, and also efforts to build an Afghan state. A central part, of course, was advancing women's rights, with huge progress being made in access to education, healthcare, and greater participation in public life. Can you just set the scene for us? I mean, what was life like in Afghanistan for Afghan women, before the Taliban advanced last year and then after the fall of the Afghan government last August?
Hi, Amy. Thanks for having me. I think that it's best to frame that with, there's been an awful lot of revisionism since the Taliban took over in August 2021. Afghanistan was regularly, in those reports that come out, scale of badness reports that we see all the time, Afghanistan was regularly the worst or one of the worst places in the world to be born female. There was an awful lot of effort put into trying to make women's lives easier, for inclusion, for women to have and develop their own agency. But it was really quite a difficult and I think fairly insubstantial, if I may say that, effort, because throwing money at a problem doesn't solve the problem, and developing and creating an educational system over the couple of generations that the Western US-led effort was in Afghanistan really didn't concentrate enough, I don't think, on really making it a profound and society-wide effort. And so even after 20 years, there was an incredible bias against women working, women going on to further education, taking up leadership posts.
And we've seen since the Taliban took over that it was really quite ephemeral. There's virtually nothing left. So the question, what was it like for Afghan women? It was very, very difficult. And, you have to start somewhere. I remember when I first started in journalism, there were very few women. And even though now most of the bosses and the people who are running media are men, at least people like me get to have a career and move around and do pretty much what we would like to do below the glass ceiling. But in Afghanistan, that ceiling was just so high that really it was a multi generational project, and it ran out. Now we're back to square one, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And I understand that some 3/4 of Afghan women live in rural areas, so outside of Kabul, where reporters, for security reasons, have historically concentrated themselves. What do we know about what's going on with the situation for Afghan women and girls now, and particularly in those rural areas that are a little bit more outside of the spotlight of the media, as limited as that is even in Kabul these days?
Well, I did travel quite far and wide as I could when I was a resident correspondent in Afghanistan, and I think that in very many places, very little has changed at all for decades, possibly centuries. Women are traditionally confined to their homes, and the homes are multi-generational compounds, but it's the men who go outside, and it's the men who do the work. Women do things like they raise children, they do home work. If they've got the ability to, or the wherewithal to, they can run little businesses, they can make pickles, but they do things that they do at home within the confines of their homes. And so it's really only in the major cities where women are even visible, who go out of their homes, go to schools, go to universities, open businesses, work in offices. So, in most of Afghanistan, very, very little has changed. Now, where the change was in the cities. And, we can't say that it wasn't significant, because millions of girls were able to go to school at least through primary ages up to 10 or 11 years old. Certainly not as many boys who were able to go to school, but that in itself has a trickle down effect. And then when you have girls from other parts of the country coming into the big cities to go to university, and some of them were able to, that also has a trickle down effect. So I would imagine that now, as I haven't been able to travel in Afghanistan outside of Kabul since the Taliban took over, that a lot of that has been curtailed, and women are once again largely not able to aspire to move outside of their homes or their villages or their towns. So yeah, it's like I was saying, it's pretty much back to square one.
The statistics that we're seeing coming out of Afghanistan on rates of poverty and food insecurity are just inconceivable. The World Food Programme estimates that 90% of households don't have enough food to eat. That is the highest rate in the world right now. And it goes without saying that the country is desperately in need of more humanitarian aid. But at the same time, the United States and other international donors have gone to these great lengths to try and find ways to get that aid to the people that need it without having it end up in the hands of the Taliban. This has been kind of one of the great debates since the fall of the Afghan government. The fear is that doing so would legitimize the rule of the Taliban by giving them financial aid, but also that in withholding humanitarian aid from the Taliban, that gives the international community some leverage to push them on things like women's rights and minority rights. What are your thoughts, having spent so long in Afghanistan and covering the fallout from the collapse of the Afghan government? I mean, what are your thoughts on this dilemma?
Oh, Amy, this is something that I find very, very difficult to get my head around, to intellectualize, to understand, and I certainly wouldn't try to justify it. Why is it that the Western community after upping sticks and leaving with those appalling scenes that we saw last year in August of this desperation to leave as quickly as possible and leave behind the mess we did. I just can't understand why it's been allowed to happen, that most of the population is now hungry. Half the population is being sequestered in their homes, abused when they go outside of their homes. Ethnic minorities are also being targeted, beaten, arrested. There's extrajudicial killings. There's arbitrary detentions. People are disappearing. Journalism has just absolutely disappeared. There are hundreds of journalists taking refuge in Pakistan next door, having fled for their lives. I don't understand why there haven't been any consequences for this, but the Taliban seem to think that they can do what they like, and they don't have any reason not to think that. There are no consequences. So when you say, when you mention things like aid going in, the United States is sending tens of millions of dollars in cash on pallets by plane into Afghanistan every week. There are no guarantees that that money is not falling into the hands of the Taliban for them to do what they like. Indeed, there are reports that the Taliban are siphoning off, I've heard, up to 25-30% of what goes in so that they can give it to themselves, to their own supporters, and it's not getting to people who really need it. So the United Nations has an office there. It's called the UN Assistant Mission for Afghanistan. Also, they cannot give any guarantees that the aid that comes in and then has to be distributed through Taliban approved non-government organisations is going to where it is needed. Now, there are small, independent, indigenous aid organisations that are using the Havala system and local distribution networks to get aid, food, clothing, fuel to small numbers of families, let's say 1,000 families at a time, or a knot of villages in the countryside, and they're able to get that through. But when I've asked UNAMA officials why this isn't more widespread, why the money has to come in the way it does and go through Taliban-approved systems, they say you couldn't possibly do what's necessary on the scale that is necessary through the Havala system and sending in small amounts of money, $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 at a time. And I don't know whether that's true or not. I hear that as an excuse, but I don't see any effort to find another way. And I don't see any consequences for the Taliban. They act with complete impunity, and what they keep doing is expanding the horror of their rule. In the past few weeks, we've seen public stonings, public floggings. We've seen women in burqas in public squares being shot in the back of the head. It's extrajudicial. There isn't a legal system. There is no law. And yet 40 million people are now subjected to this sort of treatment. I don't have any resolutions for it. I don't have any solutions. I've mentioned small Indigenous NGOs that I know of and am connected with. But other than that, I don't even get any reasoning from UN officials or US officials when I ask them why. Why is Afghanistan being treated like this? There's no justification, and there's no imagination, and there's no solution as far as I can see.
I mean, it sounds like, we're kidding ourselves to think that there's ways to get significant amounts of aid into Afghanistan without it ending up, at least in some part, in the hands of the Taliban. And in the meantime, I mean, it's Afghan civilians that are suffering, right? And in terms of women's and children's rights, I mean, starvation is also not at all advancing their well-being at a very most basic level.
Well, if you have widespread child malnutrition, as is the case, you also have intellectual stunting. And so you're impacting the next generation and the generation after that in their ability to overcome the hardships they're being subjected to now and be able to build their country when the time comes that the Taliban is no longer in control. I think that this regime is unsustainable. What we're seeing around the world now, we're seeing in Iran, we're seeing in China, we're seeing people chafing against the repression that they're subjected to. That has to be the case sometime in the future, whenever that may be in Afghanistan. People can only be starved for so long, deprived of livelihood, humiliated the way they are for so long. But the way the Taliban are being permitted to treat people is really setting the country back for generations to come.
How has Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the huge amounts of military and humanitarian aid and the refugee response that has led to, how has that impacted aid and attention going to the multidimensional crisis that is unfolding in Afghanistan?
Well, attention almost immediately ceased to be focused on Afghanistan and the tragedies that have unfolded there. There seems to be only so much bandwidth for misery and suffering, unfortunately. People who had been, I'm in London, and people who had come here from Afghanistan and had been granted asylum and refugee status were asked to leave. The same happened in other European countries. They were asked to leave their accommodation overnight so that they could make way for people coming for Ukraine. It wasn't like they were here and we have space for people who are suffering as well in other countries. They were displaced. The price of wheat, as we know, and the supply has been truncated and prices have gone up. And the WFP, the World Food Programme, buys wheat for distribution to those in need on the world market. And it has a finite amount of money, as do other charities that are buying food for distribution to the needy everywhere in the world. So they're able to buy less, which means there's less available for people who are relying on charity to feed themselves and their children. The northern border of Afghanistan is next to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. These countries grow food and have traditionally exported it to Afghanistan. But once the war in Ukraine began, they stopped exporting because their own supplies coming in from Russia were under threat, and that tenuousness made them wary about the supplies for their own people, and so that meant less was going into Afghanistan. So it's had an immediate, and it's now 9 or 10 months since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this is ongoing, and now winter is setting in the Himalayas, and it's only going to get worse.
Lynn, thank you so much for this very sobering conversation on the situation in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Amy.
Up next, please welcome Anna Slother, Executive Vice President at Chemonics, who will set the stage for our next conversation focusing on the impact of corruption on women and how they are fighting back. Anna will be joined by journalist and author Mariana Atencio.
Hi. Good morning. Buenos dias. How are you, Anna?
Good. Good morning. We're between this and lunch, I understand.
Yes. So thank you for sticking with us. I want you all to participate during this panel. Submit your questions, because I will be able to read some of the questions coming in from you and coming in from everyone who's tuning in online. So Anna, I want to thank you so much for making this possible, for the invitation. Can you set the scene for us in terms of the impact of corruption on women? What are you seeing in terms of the developmental context?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple of key messages that I would focus on today, and it's been a really rich morning listening to everybody, honestly. I think, we need to focus on the impact of corruption on the underrepresented groups, and we need to go beyond the silos of it as a governance issue. Those are, I think, two pretty key things as we look at across the development space of what needs to be studied and looked at. The impact against economic growth and basic citizen services. We are implementing a program in Peru where corruption truly disproportionately impacts them when it comes to budget cuts in the country, impacting maternal child health, education, all of those things that are direct impacts on them. And in a recent survey that the program conducted, 86% of Peruvians identify corruption as something impacting their daily lives, and 22% say it directly impacts their access to basic services as citizens, right? So what are we doing? We're getting women to the table. We're empowering them in 5 regions across Peru to lead integrity panels, be a part of public procurement, which is typically rampant for different types of corruption, and really putting them in some of those key roles to start to be part of the solution. And I think that's one of the really key pieces in terms of bringing those impacted and the most vulnerable to the table to discuss the issues and try to resolve them.
Because of course, when you talk about the rollback of progress and those resources being taken away, the first ones to suffer the brunt of it are women.
That's right. That's right.
And that's why we have an amazing
That's
panel
exactly right.
for you today.
And you recently finished an investigation, I understand, in Central America. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Thank you for bringing that up. That's a big part of the reason why I'm here. I spent the larger part of this year finding out what happened to 2 women who were Dutch tourists in Panama. They went up a trail and completely vanished. And I retraced their steps 8 years to the day after their disappearance and found that at every point, from the search teams to the cops, the forensics, they were dismissed as victims. They were depraved from justice, mainly for being women. Their names were Chris Kramers and Lisanne Froon, but this case goes beyond them. We found over 50 local cases of women and girls who have disappeared in the region, in this 40-mile corridor of Panama, since 2009. And that is why I'm here, because it takes all of you in this room, women who are agents of change, women who are fighting back, to say their names and to bring justice to these women. And that's why I appreciate the platform. If you guys want to look it up, it's called Lost in Panama. It came out as an investigative podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. So thank you for the support and for shedding light on it. Thank you so much, Anna. I'm going to ask you to please come off stage because we have an amazing panel of experts, of women who are activists, scholars, and really doing tremendous policy work so that we can not only talk about the impact of corruption on women, but how women are fighting back. So I'm going to wait for our announcer, and I want you to give them a big round of applause as they come on stage.
Now, please welcome Marcela Escobari, the Assistant Administrator of the Bureau of Latin American and the Caribbean at USAID, Dr. Claudia Escobar Mejia, Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government, and Roberta Solis, Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Officer at UNODC.
Welcome, ladies. Bienvenidas. Marcela, let me start with you. As USAID's Assistant Administrator who oversees Latin America and the Caribbean region, how do you view the challenge of advancing gender equality and women's empowerment, particularly as it relates to corruption, which is the issue at hand today?
Great, thank you, Mariana. Great to be here. Great to be here with you guys, who are really the heroes of the story. So I think it's important to maybe look at these issues separately and then how they combine, right? Unfortunately, in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have pervasive gender inequality. We see it in the rates of gender-based violence, in wage gap, in teenage pregnancies, and you can keep counting. And the issue is that some of these issues are quite sticky. Like, we have made incredible progress in certain issues on the input side, like education. More women are graduating from college in Latin America, in most of it, than men, except for a couple countries, Bolivia and Mexico. Yet, we don't see that change in the representation of women in positions of power, in the business sector, in public office. And same with teenage pregnancies. We are the second worst region, and we're the worst region in terms of progress of seeing these teenage pregnancies and underage marriage going down. So that's a structural issue in and of itself that should raise the urgency on the issue of gender inequality. Now, corruption is also pervasive, and A lot of corruption is about maintaining power, existing power hierarchies, right? Diverting resources to the most powerful from the most vulnerable. So as women are in these weaker positions, then these two combine in a really nocive way. So we do need to face these two forces separately: corruption, gender inequality, how they and as well as how they combine, in a particularly detrimental way.
I love that you brought up how corruption, it just strengthens the patriarchy, if you will. Now to you, Claudia, can you tell me how corruption exacerbates these existing power dynamics, especially when it comes to women accessing, what we were talking about before with Anna, accessing public resources, for example?
Well, I think that corruption undermines all rights for everybody, but especially for vulnerable population, for women, for indigenous, for kids, because corruption doesn't allow a country to develop, So it's extremely dangerous in Latin America because some of the countries, there are not only pervasive corruption, but it's a systemic corruption. We have kleptocracies where people are not going to be able to develop all their skills, especially women, and as I said, other vulnerable populations.
When it comes to all of the different forms of corruptions, one of the big things is the judicial system, and that's the work that you've been leading, Roberta. So tell us, what measures have you seen are being taken to make justice systems more inclusive and protective of women and other marginalized populations? And if you can give us an example, that would be great.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and share the work that we have been doing at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. In 2018, we launched the Global Judicial Integrity Network, a platform for judges around the world to support efforts against corruption in the justice system and to strengthen integrity, because that's one of the key components of preventing corruption. And one of the areas that we have worked since the beginning is on gender-related judicial integrity issues. Which not only affect the delivery of justice, but also how female judges are impacted in the justice system. One of our main activities was publishing a paper on the gender issues in the judiciary that identifies the different issues and how judiciaries can address them through strengthening codes of conduct, through strengthening disciplinary measures, and strengthening training, especially also for the male judges, because usually these issues tend to be kind of confined to the female, that women discuss women's issues. But we are seeing, especially in Latin America, as we are looking at the region, many judiciaries adopting what is called a gender protocol. And that started with the pioneer experience of the Mexican judiciary after a decision of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And these protocols are guidance, but also ethical tenets for the judges on how to deliver justice, on how to deliver their judgments with a gender perspective. And it's that in various areas. So it started with Mexico, and now we have Chile, Bolivia, Brazil, Trinidad and Tobago, and other countries adopting this, which is a very good way of addressing the problem, because this becomes really a part of the judiciary and how the judges have to behave in the delivery of justice.
And adopting that gender lens, it's amazing to say, but it's like relatively new. The New York Times report came out this week that the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, for the first time, they're making this big structural change in addressing issues of gender-based violence with a new division. Because sometimes when you have a woman who may be an immigrant, there may be child issues involved, justice issues involved, translation services, immigration services, she just fell through the cracks, and it's not seen as a case that deserves that lens of that just added lens of gender. Marcela, when it comes to how USAID is fighting corruption, can you tell us what you are doing, especially because it is such a corrosive problem in the region?
Sure, and it is the kind of activities that Claudia and Roberta just talked about that we try to support. And I think the way that we think about it is prevention and accountability. And in prevention, there are issues like having an independent press, having a vibrant civil society that can actually hold government accountable, having a fair judicial system. And then there are other issues that are less glamorous, right? That just bring transparency to the system, like a procurement law and digitizing budget systems and that kind of technical work that technology can help us be, like bring transparency. As Supreme Court Judge Brandeis said, sunshine is the best disinfectant, right? And then when it comes to accountability, it is the harder part, the tech-savvy prosecutorial teams, right? Being able to support independent judges, that people who are corrupt and who, go above the law are taken to justice. And because it creates a virtuous cycle, because if they are prosecuted, then it serves as a deterrent for future corruption. And there, it takes brave people like the folks that we have in this panel, right, that are fighting the good fight. I was just in Ecuador and met with Attorney General Salazar, who single-handedly really shifted, democratic values in that country. Or Judge Jasmine Barrios in Guatemala, who's currently, right, defending the rule of law in an environment that it is where many of her colleagues have been in jail, had to leave the country, right? Being courageous should not, and fighting for the rule of law should not cost you your life and your livelihood. And I think that's up to all of us here, where we can speak up to really raise their voices, defend those brave voices, but also work on those structural issues so that it doesn't take that much courage to follow the law.
And Claudia, Marcela just mentioned Guatemala, which is where you're from, and you and I were talking off camera about just how it's devolved in many ways. You yourself, your research specializes in criminal organizations. So when you look at the region, Central America, but obviously also Mexico, Brazil, many other countries, when you talk about corruption, we've talked about democratic institutions, but what happens when it's really criminal organizations that are calling the shots?
Well, I think it's important to understand that it's not the same to be a judge in a place like the United States, France, Canada, than being a judge in Guatemala, Nicaragua, or Venezuela. You really put your life at risk. I saw firsthand, how difficult it was to tackle corruption. Every time I tried to expose corruption to that level, I received death threats, until the moment that I had to face the head of the Congress that was trying to bribe me for a resolution that will favor the vice president. That was the moment when I said, I need to expose this level of corruption. I need to talk publicly about what is going on, because not only as a woman, but also as a mom that has kids and want them to live in a place that they can feel free, you need to work for justice. And you need to make the justice system work. So it is very important to fight for the independence of the judiciary, and that's something that my generation was doing. I think that every country has windows of opportunities, and that's when you have to do the effort to establish the check of balance, the rule of law, but it's not easy. So there's always going to be organized crime trying to set back all the advantages that we were able to make.
Mm-hmm. And what Claudia said is very true. In a way, you have to build institutions when they're not under attack, right? Because then when you have leaders that are willing to do so, just to make it harder for those that want to attack them when these political cycles exist, and sometimes counterintuitive.
And we know that in the region there are those windows that you really have to take advantage of. Roberta, when you look at sort of the state of this issue now, in the post-pandemic, the pre-pandemic wasn't so great for women, but how would you say that COVID-19 really allowed many authoritarian leaders to roll back progress that had been made on gender equality?
This is also part of our broader work on the gender dimensions of corruption, not only on the judiciary, but also in general. I even have one of our flagship publications here, The Time Is Now. And it shows that, and it's not just the COVID pandemic, we also have on our publication other examples of other health crises, for example, after the tsunami, after the Ebola outbreak. And we would think that we have learned the lessons of how this disproportionately impacts women. But then with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, we see that we haven't really learned those lessons, and that's a reflection of how gender inequality is still a pervasive issue and widespread. And the COVID-19 pandemic also brought in additional challenges, not only with corruption. So, for example, greater difficulty in accessing health systems, treatments for COVID. We've seen this in various countries, how in the pandemic we had a rise in corruption with procurement being expedited, cutting corners to purchase equipment or even vaccines for in general in the healthcare system. But we've seen also how we also saw the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence in this period, affecting even more women. Judiciaries also had a difficult time in adapting to the pandemic so they could address these issues. A lot of the judiciaries moved into virtual hearings, virtual proceedings, and that becomes even more difficult for women who are being abused at home, who are facing gender violence at home, domestic violence cases. So how would they go into court in a virtual hearing alongside with their partners, and how can they on camera say, well, I have a problem? So judiciaries also had a big problem in adjusting to this situation. So we've seen that we haven't learned our lessons. Gender inequality continues to be a problem, and it was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And in our work, we have also, in our publications, in our work, we also make it very clear how gender inequality and corruption, how they mutually reinforce themselves. So in a way, anti-corruption and gender equality mutually reinforce themselves. Because when you have more women at the table, at position of power, just by having women there, it's not just that women themselves will be less corrupt or corruptible. That's also a myth that we have to stay away from. But it's that the presence of women disrupts collusive networks that have been in place because of single gender-dominated environments. Yeah. So that's also a big point that we make in our work in how to address corruption and gender, but in how we can mainstream gender to strengthen anti-corruption measures.
And thank you for bringing up the work that you do in terms of also labeling violence against women, the shadow pandemic. 1 in 3 women, according to the World Health Organization, will experience some sort of violence just for being women in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is astounding to me. In that regard, this word femicide that is very common, unfortunately, but at least the terminology is normalized in places like Mexico, Central America, is not a word that you hear here in the United States. It's not commonly used by the media. I think when women suffer cases of violence or even killings, it's just kind of labeled a homicide. Marcela, why do you think that is, that terminology here still has not been normalized?
Well, I don't know if I know why it hasn't been normalized. I think these issues that we've been talking about the existing system of power and the patriarchy that is part of the way that we do business, right? So it feels kind of second nature. Disrupting that is really difficult and yet important, right? Just to give you a couple examples of what we're talking about, right? When you talk about femicide and gender-based violence, impunity the rates are outstanding. 98% of the cases that are brought to justice, nothing happens. 98%, and those are the ones that are brought to justice.
And just the bravery that it takes, right?
To even get there. So it's within a system that has normalized that. When we were talking to the Attorney General Salazar, and they were just dealing with this big public upheaval from the murder of a woman within like the police barracks, she said 60% of Ecuadorians have normalized domestic violence, right? And sometimes, you know, I do think there are heroes in the justice system that are men and there are women, but sometimes it takes a woman like Salazar to say, we've got to do something so that, because this, you know, in public opinion it's going to be hard, and it has to be the laws, the justice that switch this around versus the other way around.
So we have almost 5 minutes left. I want you to keep your questions coming. We have our first question coming in, and this is from Samudia at George Washington University here in Washington, D.C., and she asks, how can we unite women from various socioeconomic, religious, ethnic backgrounds and women who are members of LGBTQ communities or have disabilities? So is there a Justice League of women that you know, can dovetail that kind of intersectionality? I don't know any of you who want to take that question.
Well, I think that...
Go ahead, Claudia, go ahead.
We need to find a common purpose. We need to defend human rights. We need to understand that if we don't have freedom, if we don't feel safe, nobody can really, I don't know, make sure that their rights are respected. So that's the way we can unite it, you know, in one common purpose. But I just wanted to also add something that you comment about impunity. You know, you're talking about the paradise of criminal activities. So that's what we need to change. We need to make sure that there's no country that is ruled by the mafia. And that's what is happening in some of the countries in Central America right now. Organized crime is running the institutions. And I think that the whole region is at risk. When you have one country that is ruled by autocrats or kleptocrats, the whole region suffers.
And we're not talking about the Middle East, we're talking about, you know, our very hemisphere. I want to finish with 2 quick lightning rounds for the 3 of you. The prior panel, I loved that Rina asked about hope. What gives you hope? So if the 3 of you can each give me a story, a success case, a country, a city that gives you hope in terms of gender equality, we'd love to hear it. Who wants to start?
Oh, so, well, there are a lot of examples of things changing. One of the things when we think about combating gender inequality is we tend to believe that we want to change belief systems. And if people just knew that women are just as capable and just as good, and we show them the data, then actions would change, right? And then you're going to elect women and put them. And what we have found is that it's the opposite. Actions change belief systems. When you see women in power, and they're just as good, when you see women rising to the occasion and being, you know, courageous leaders in the judicial system, you're like, they rock, right? Like, we need to have that representation because it shows it's possible. And I think we're seeing it throughout the region. I'm going to give one kind of example of something in the weeds that matters when we change the rules, right? We worked in Colombia in the peace process for a really long time, supporting the Colombian government through, and there were these rules, very archaic rules on who gets to own land, and if you're an unmarried woman or whatnot, it became really difficult to own land. And we worked with the government to change those rules and to update them. And now when we're working on giving titling, land titles, in the most remote conflict-ridden areas, 50% of our land titles are going to women. That's great. Right? It's like, it's a story that started a long time ago, but that we can see the result. And when you give it economic power, other things start to resolve themselves.
Thank you for that example. Claudia, on to you next. Algo que te da esperanza, a story that gives you hope or a case.
Yeah, I think that one country in my region in Central America that is very different from the rest is Costa Rica. And we have to look at that as an example. You know, how women are treated there, how their rights are respected there, and it's a country that should give us hope. But there is also another place that I think is important to understand, Ukraine. In Ukraine, before the war, there was also a lot of problems of corruption. But civil society took a stand, and they were fighting against that, and they were promoting different projects to defend judges and creating especially courts that you know, we're going to be able to fight corruption. And that was a few years before the war started. So we still hope that after that they can.
And we're seeing women lead a lot of the resistance, and it's probably part of the fruits of that as well. Roberta?
Various things give me hope, actually. With first of all, seeing all of this discussion, seeing the work that has been done in a lot of countries. Like I mentioned, the example of many countries taking on gender protocols for their judiciaries. Another thing that gives me hope is a recent example that with our publication on the gender dimensions of corruption, the Attorney General's Office of Argentina, by themselves, took our publication and developed a 2-hour training for all of their staff on gender and corruption. So it gives us hope that the work that we're doing is also being disseminated and being taken on by authorities. We have also other examples in the publication of how women themselves organize themselves to fight corrupt structures in their countries. We had an example from Ghana. There's also one from Indonesia, women in business defending their interests. But I also invite everyone to look at our publication because we also have a set of actionable recommendations on how to mainstream gender in anti-corruption programming, which is also very important for us to continue this fight. But I also want to add something that doesn't give me so much hope, is that we still need better data, qualitative and quantitative data on the impact of corruption on women. We need data in general on corruption. That's something that we're not in an ideal spot yet for all of the countries, but most of all for women, because if you're invisible in the data, you're going to be invisible in the policies. It's going to be very hard to address the problem. Identifying it might be a bit easier, but acting also requires better data.
Thank you so much for that. Just briefly, I'll say that this room gives me hope, and we cannot underestimate what happens when two women who are determined to do something get together, or a group of women. When we come together, we become unstoppable. So my call to action for you is to take the time, talk to our 3 panelists when they get off stage today, make meaningful connections amongst yourselves, because one real thing that we can do is amplify each other's impacts, rally around our projects, right? If we want to see more women in power, let's rally around those who are already doing good things. It is really in our hands. So thank you so much for being here today.
At this time, please welcome Claire Furbush, Senior Strategic Accounts Manager at Foreign Policy.
Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us. I'm Claire Furbush, and it's been my privilege to be a part of pulling together the Her Power Summit over my past 3 years at Foreign Policy. It's wonderful to see you all in person. Today, we've already heard from female foreign policy leaders in Congress, multilateral institutions, U.S. government agencies, and the media. But now we're going to change tack as we enter our mentorship lunch session. At each table, there's a mentor who has joined us today to share their insights, foster discussion, and answer questions. In a moment, I'll invite you all to grab lunch and rejoin your table, where each mentor will kick off the conversation by introducing themselves and sharing their perspectives. Each mentor will then invite all participants to briefly introduce themselves before beginning the discussion and answering any questions you all might have. We couldn't be more appreciative of the mentors here today, who represent female leaders at the forefront of economic justice, climate change, tech and innovation, gender-based violence, women's health, feminist political leadership, democracy and governance, and more. Thank you again for lending us your time and insights and helping to guide the female leaders of the future. We're also thrilled to have with us today representatives from a range of organizations dedicated to helping women break into and succeed in male-dominated fields, including the Women's Foreign Policy Group, Women in International Trade, Women in International Security, Women in Technology, and more. Thank you for joining us and helping us to do our part to advance the important mentorship and networking work you do every day. The value of mentorship could hardly be higher, particularly for women seeking to climb the ladder in male-dominated fields like foreign policy. As our own FP Analytics Her Power Index found, in 2018, women constituted just a third of those working in U.S. government foreign policy, and just 23% of the U.S.'s ambassadors. Although we'll hear from Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley this afternoon about the steps she's spearheading at state. As our events and analysis in the women, peace, and security space has underscored, an absence of female representation in peace and security processes leads to substantially worse and more fragile outcomes. With the world rapidly reverting to a Cold War turned hot, and the proportion of women participating in peace and security processes slipping, women constituted just 19% of delegations in UN-led peace processes in 2022, down from 23% in 2020. The time is now to reassert the importance of female voices being at the table. But speaking of female voices at the table, it's my pleasure to invite you all to get your lunches at the buffet, which is just outside, and return to your tables for our mentoring lunch to begin. Thank you again for joining us and for being a part of these conversations.